Good day. My last video, as all of you know, was on the topic of the Quad summit in the United States, the Quad being this regional grouping that the United States is trying to construct in the Indo-Pacific region to contain China. However, it's also fair to say that my analysis of the Quad summit is almost unique, but even in mainstream media, if only because the event itself was utterly overshadowed by the Canadian release of Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei, the Chinese mobile phone company, who has now returned to China and whose enforced stay in Canada, which has lasted for 3 years, has now ended. I find it a remarkable fact in itself that the United States allowed the Quad summit to be overshadowed to such an extent by an event like the release of Meng Wanzhou. One might have expected that the United States, which, to be very clear, is the country which made the decisive decisions, would have waited a week for the news of the Quad summit to gain more traction. As I've discussed in my last video, it might even have been the case that the decision to release Meng Wanzhou at that precise moment might have been influenced by disappointment that the United States might feel at the outcome of the Quad summit. But that now brings me to the topic of the release of Meng Wanzhou herself and to the affair which caused her arrest. And in this program, I'm going to look at the winners and losers from this affair, which, as at least they seem to me. And I'm going to say straight away that in geopolitical terms, the United States is the clear-cut winner. Now, I know this is something that you are not going to find in many places or in much commentary, but in my opinion, the facts speak for themselves, and in this case, they are unchallengeable. Let us dial back to 2018, the year when Meng Wanzhou was arrested in Canada so unexpectedly, to the dismay of the Chinese and to the astonishment of most of the world. I should say that we now know that the decision to arrest Meng Wanzhou was largely taken by John Bolton, who was at that time the United States' national security advisor, having been recently appointed to that position by the then President Donald Trump. John Bolton and Donald Trump subsequently badly fell out, with Donald Trump becoming increasingly exasperated by the way in which John Bolton was conducting the foreign policy of the United States in ways which contradicted the president's own foreign policy objectives, and the relationship between the two men has now become poisonous. But back in 2018, John Bolton appeared to have the president's confidence and was able to make extraordinary decisions like this. Now, let's also consider what was happening in the world, or at least in the world of communications technology, back in 2018. At that time, it seemed as if China was forging ahead with 5G technologies and that the United States was far away, struggling in its wake. It also appeared that Huawei, which was the company that was leading the Chinese effort to develop 5G networks, was an all-conquering behemoth. It had surpassed Apple, both in overall capitalization and in mobile phone sales, and it was negotiating successfully with a string of Western governments in Europe and elsewhere to help those governments set up 5G networks. That was happening in Germany, in France, in Britain, all across the West. And of course, for someone like John Bolton, for the people in the United States who seek confrontation with China, not just at a commercial level, but also at a geopolitical level, this was an extreme and alarming threat. It appeared that China was managing to win economic and political leverage over the United States' own allies at a time when people like Bolton also wanted to strengthen the Western alliance and consolidate it behind the United States in confrontation with the Eurasian powers, China and Russia. And as well as John Bolton's concerns, there were the concerns of some other people in the United States. There were the concerns of people in the intelligence community who were worried, perhaps with some cause. I'm not an expert on technical matters, but for all I know, there might have been some grounds to this, that Huawei, establishing 5G networks across Europe, would enable the Chinese to tap into communications in European countries and to harvest a great deal of data and even intelligence that way. I know some people believe these claims to be wildly exaggerated. I'm not in a position to say one way or the other, but certainly that was a widespread meme at the time. And lastly, and perhaps closest to the sentiments of the president himself, of Donald Trump, there was the sense held by many people in the United States, a feeling, by the way, that many people in the United States still have, that China had stolen a march on the United States economically, that had built up its high-tech sector by stealing or obtaining illicitly American technologies, and that China was posing an increasing economic challenge to the United States, and that China's mighty export industries had devastated core industries in the United States, and that China had been able to seduce United States industrialists and business groups to close down their factories in the United States and to relocate them in China. Now, again, I would say straight away that I think some of these claims are exaggerated. I certainly think that people in the United States underestimate, for example, the extent to which China itself, using its own resources, was able to build up its technological base. It does have many universities which churn out millions of scientists and engineers, and through my academic contacts in Britain, I can say with confidence that some of these scientists and some of these engineers are first-rate people. But having said that, again, one may feel that some of these claims are exaggerated, but there is still nonetheless, in my opinion, at least a certain grain of truth in them, in that it is true that American industrial groups were indeed relocating their factories in China, an example being, of course, Apple itself, and it is also true that Chinese exports to the United States were indeed competing successfully and undermining, through that competition, American industries. Now, again, that may simply be a reflection of China's enormous economic strengths rather than any evil practices on the part of the Chinese. I'm not here to judge on that issue. All I am saying is that there were many people in the United States, including at that time the president himself, who felt with some cause that the economic relationship between the United States and China had become extremely unequal, and that China was, as a result, achieving advantages over the United States in terms of economic competition. So all of these factors came together, making many people in Washington and in the United States see Huawei and China as a major challenge and threat in the development of 5G networks. And that is the trigger cause for the decision to arrest in Canada Meng Wanzhou. And it needs to be said straight away that that extraordinary step galvanized opposition to Huawei across the Western world, exactly as the United States had intended. The United States was able, following the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, to launch a massive publicity campaign against Huawei across Europe, and was able to cite the charges it had brought against Meng Wanzhou as evidence of that company's financial and economic and business malpractices. It was also, and perhaps this is even more important, able to show the Europeans the determination it was bringing to this matter. The fact that the United States was able to lean on Canada and get such a high executive of Huawei arrested in that sort of way convinced everybody in Europe that on this topic the Americans were deadly serious. And what happened over the next few weeks and months and years is that gradually, step by step, all the European countries that had been working with Huawei ceased to do so. Huawei began to lose many of its cooperation agreements with American businesses and American companies, and the challenge that some people saw from Huawei and from China in terms of 5G networks was beaten back. Now, Huawei survives. It continues to be a gigantic company in China itself. It is now forging links with China, with Russia. It is apparently working with the Russians on developing its own operating system. And I have no doubt at all that Huawei will remain a major force in the world of international communications and in mobile phone and other technologies. But it is not any longer the all-conquering behemoth which it appeared to be in 2018. And in that respect, one has to say, and this is a point that needs to be made and needs to be made clear, the United States, in that it has managed to beat it back. Huawei is not the force internationally that it was, and the United States has been able, as a result, to gain space and time to develop rival 5G networks to those of China and Russia. However, all of this has come at an enormous cost. And I'm going to now express my own view, which is that in achieving this momentary, though important victory, the United States has paid a price which many people in the United States probably don't recognize and won't acknowledge, but which will work against the United States' interests in the long run and will do the United States, in my opinion, considerable damage. And what I mean by this is that the case against Meng Wanzhou was almost entirely, in fact, was entirely political. Briefly, I've already discussed the role that John Bolton played in organising Meng Wanzhou's arrest, and that makes it absolutely clear that this was an arrest carried out for political reasons. But perhaps even more disturbing is the fact that the case against Meng Wanzhou, as it has been unveiled in the Canadian courts, is to all intents and purposes no sort of case at all. I have been trying increasingly to understand it. Meng Wanzhou has been accused, apparently, of tax and wire frauds and other sorts of frauds. I'm not entirely clear what those allegations are, because they make, to me, extraordinarily little sense. And perhaps it's important to say that the Canadian courts have struggled to make any sense of it either. I am now going to quote Heather Holmes, Associate Chief Justice of Canada, who made the following point. Isn't it unusual that one will see a fraud case with no actual harm many years later, and one in which the alleged victim, a large institution, appears to have had numerous people within the institution who had all the facts that are now said to be misrepresented. What is being alleged here is that, in fact, Meng Wanzhou had kept all the various people, including the various senior staff in HSBC, the bank that she was in contact with and which she's alleged to have perpetrated or helped Huawei perpetrate the fraud against, about the fact that Huawei's had a relationship with a subsidiary accused of sanctions busting in connection with Iran, which was, of course, the ultimate cause of the basis of the entire case against her. In other words, Meng Wanzhou was telling HSBC exactly what Huawei was up to, and HSBC didn't lose any money, was perfectly well aware of what Huawei was doing, and this was, in effect, simply a case not of fraud, but of an exchange of information between two companies which, for their own reasons, nonetheless decided to maintain relations with each other. Given that this is so, I absolutely do not understand the nature of the legal case. Now, it's arguable whether or not there was even a criminal case involving the sanctions. I'm not sure, anyway, that this was something that the Canadian courts would have recognized and would have extradited Meng Wanzhou herself about. But the actual case where extradition proceedings were brought, this case of fraud involving HSBC, doesn't appear to have bothered HSBC, bewildered the Canadian courts, and might have struggled to succeed in the American courts had it ever been prosecuted there. Having said that, the decision was nonetheless made by the United States to have Meng Wanzhou arrested, held in detention in Canada for 3 years, and have this protracted case brought against her there, keeping her in detention in Canada until she was finally released just a few days ago. And I have to say that, to me, this looks, frankly, like another case of what has come to be known as lawfare. This is the use of the criminal justice system and of the courts, including the civil courts of the West, in this case of the United States and Canada, to wage political war against the geopolitical enemies of the United States. The United States and its Western allies have been doing this repeatedly against Russia, for example. There was that recent, very bizarre case resurrecting the Litvinenko matter in the European Court of Human Rights, which was decided the other day. For example, a case where I struggle to see what role the European Court of Human Rights even had to consider that decision. And then, of course, there was the equally bizarre case, which is still winding its way through the Dutch courts, in which the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague and the Dutch courts continue to pretend that Russia is subject to the EU's third energy package, even though Russia has declined to join the EU's third energy package. So we have seen an increasing amount of this kind of lawfare being waged against Russia. And by the way, the United States has for a long time now been in the habit of getting various countries through which Russian citizens travel, Russian citizens in whom the United States is interested for whatever reasons, and it's become increasingly common for the United States to do to those people what it's done to Meng Wanzhou, pressure those third countries to arrest these people and to extradite them to the United States. But it's fair to say that Meng Wanzhou is far and away the most prominent and important person subjected to this kind of treatment. And to me, to be straightforward about this, it looks like a legally licensed kidnapping, an attempt by the US authorities using the Canadian authorities to assist them to seize somebody, in this case Meng Wanzhou, on frankly legally dubious charges in order to get them to the United States so that the United States can extract political advantage from the fact. Now, I have to say straightforwardly that I find this an extremely disturbing development. It is something that fills me with misgivings, to put it mildly. It looks to me to be a perversion, even a corruption of the entire point of justice and of the impartial administration of justice. And not only is that so, but I would add that by taking this step, by using its legal system and getting other Western countries to use their legal systems in this sort of way, what the United States is doing is undermining its own reason, its own ultimate cause. And here I'm going to come back to a fundamental question that I think Americans need to start asking themselves as they become more involved, or at least as they increasingly become involved in this sort of conduct. What kind of a nation, what kind of a country do they want the United States ultimately to be? Do they want it to be an empire based on power? If so, if the whole argument is always about power and nothing else, then yes, indeed, the United States has won a geopolitical victory. Lawfare, in the case of Meng Wanzhou, has worked to the United States' advantage. But does the United States really want to be that? Does it want to be a country based on power, an empire, if you like? Well, if you listen to people like John Bolton, you get the clear impression that that's certainly what he wants. But is that what most Americans want to see? Is that the kind of United States that they want to live in? Or do they prefer to live in a republic, a country founded on its constitution, with respect for the rule of law, where justice is administered impartially, in aspiration, if not always in fact, where citizens have legal protections given to them by the Constitution and by the laws, and where the United States acts in that same consistent manner in its treatment of the citizens of other countries, impartially administering its laws with respect to those citizens, even if it has grounds to be, shall we say, in conflict with them. Well, I have absolutely no doubt which United States I prefer to see. I've absolutely no doubt that I prefer the Republic, and from my many interactions with many Americans, I've no doubt that that's what most Americans feel and want to see also. But lawfare, it must be said straightforwardly, especially when conducted in order to achieve geopolitical objectives, is absolutely in conflict with that. It essentially undermines it. And if the United States is going to pitch itself against countries like China and Russia as a country where ultimately it is power that matters and where it's willing and able to use its courts in order to achieve geopolitical objectives that may be entirely detached from any legal or legally grounded concepts, then I wonder why, in that case, any country should prefer the United States to China and Russia. After all, the United States' criticism of those countries is that they are also power-based states and that they do not have the kind of constitutional and legal and democratic protections and traditions that the United States has. In my opinion, it is that argument that has always given the United States a position of advantage with respect to those alternative powers. And giving away that enormous advantage in order to win a momentary battle against the Chinese over 5G, I think, is too high a price to pay. And the sequel to what happened after Meng Wanzhou's arrest confirms the fact, because shortly after Meng Wanzhou was arrested, the Chinese took an action which is clear to me neither the Americans nor the Canadians had anticipated. The Chinese arrested and held in detention 2 Canadian citizens against whom they brought various espionage charges. Now, that was clearly done in retaliation to the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. I say that, I'm well aware of the fact that the Chinese government denies the fact, but the fact that these 2 people were released at the same time as Meng Wanzhou was released, to my mind, says the whole story. And I would say that this is unprecedented. Now, I've mentioned before that the United States has been in the habit for some time of getting third countries to extradite Russian citizens that the United States wants to get its hands on to the United States, and this is often also done on extremely flimsy or dubious charges. And I would add that there's something like 50 Russian citizens currently in American prisons who have been arrested by the United States, often in that precise sort of way and on those sort of charges. The Russians have retaliated up to a certain point by arresting American citizens. I'm not going to discuss these cases in detail. In most cases, the people who have been arrested have been charged by the Russians with various corruption or, in some cases, espionage-related charges. That is a departure. Previously, when relations between the United States and Russia were much better, the Russians did not bring charges of that nature against American citizens. They simply asked them to leave the country, which of course they did. In this case, they've now started, increasingly now, they've started, on the contrary, to arrest them and to hold them in detention as they try to negotiate and bargain with the United States for the release of their own citizens. But the Russians have never taken the further step which the Chinese took, which is to arrest citizens of the third countries which extradited those Russians to the United States. The Chinese did that in relation to Meng Wanzhou. They arrested 2 Canadian citizens in China, and they began a fierce campaign against Canada itself, putting Canada under extreme pressure. And I predict that given that we are now in a state of lawfare, that is going to happen to an increasing degree. Moreover, there is a risk that this could even start to escalate. After all, if the United States is in a position to put pressure on third countries to extradite their citizens to extradite Chinese and Russian citizens to the United States, well, why shouldn't China and Russia start to play the same game? Why shouldn't they start not just to arrest American citizens, but perhaps put pressure on those countries to extradite US citizens to China and Russia? And why, given the example of what has happened with the Chinese action in response to the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, why might they not also start to arrest the citizens of these third countries if they refuse to play ball, if they don't agree to return the citizens of China and Russia to those countries rather than extradite them to the US, or if they fail, for example, to extradite to China and Russia US citizens that the Chinese and Russians might be interested in. We are in very real danger now, it seems to me, of a free-for-all in this matter, one in which I suspect that the Chinese and the Russians hold long-term advantages. And given that it is the United States itself which initiated this game of lawfare against those countries, it's going to be very difficult, or much more difficult, for the United States to make a convincing argument against it. Note, for example, that Canada barely even tried. It never really made a sustained effort to put China in the dock for the arrest of its 2 citizens. It failed to do so because Canada, the Trudeau government, was perfectly well aware of the true reasons for Meng Wanzhou's arrest and struggled to come up with a convincing case or argument that it could deploy against China when China did the same thing to Canadian citizens in response. So lawfare, whilst it has obvious advantages, at least in the minds of people like John Bolton, ultimately, to my mind, to my thinking, is a disastrous approach, a disastrous road for the United States and its allies to take. And I would hope that this affair, the Meng Wanzhou affair, and the way in which it has ended might teach them that fact. And I say that because there is no doubt that the way in which this thing has ended, despite the clear-cut geopolitical victory that the United States achieved at the outset, has also been embarrassing for the United States, and that also needs to be said clearly. Because the deal which has been done has been a deal which is entirely in China's favour. Meng Wanzhou has emphatically and categorically refused to plead guilty to any crime. As I have said, and as the Justice, the Canadian Justice, Heather Holmes, has also said, or in effect said, it's actually exceedingly difficult to construct a convincing case of a crime around anything that Meng Wanzhou was accused by the United States of having done. So she categorically refused to do that. She has admitted to wrongdoing, but wrongdoing is not the same as pleading guilty to a crime. And I have to say straight away that this looks to me like a, frankly, rather ridiculous concession to the United States, one which actually redounds against the United States more than it does against China and Huawei. Because, of course, wrongdoing takes place all the time. Very little of it amounts to serious crime, and most of it never gets prosecuted. And Meng Wanzhou, admitting to a certain form of wrongdoing but refusing to plead guilty to any crime, is in effect saying that it is the United States that acted disproportionately and inappropriately and perhaps even oppressively in this matter. So this has been a humiliation for the United States, and the reason, moreover, why it's been a humiliation is because the United States, by accepting Meng Wanzhou's admission of wrongdoing, but her refusal to plead guilty, and nonetheless agreeing to her release, is in effect admitting that the original case against her was not a strong one and might never have succeeded in the American courts. So the United States has been maneuvered into a position as a result of the lawfare tactics that John Bolton followed back in 2018. It has been maneuvered into admitting that it used its own justice system to achieve geopolitical ends. Now, again, this is probably something that some people like John Bolton, don't really care about. And perhaps it's something that only a very small minority of people are even aware of, at least in the United States. But the world doesn't end at the borders of the United States or even at the borders of the NATO alliance. Around the world, this will have been noticed. It will certainly have been noticed in China. It will certainly have been noticed in Russia. And of course, it will have been noticed too in that large number of countries, the majority of countries around the world, which are not yet committed to either side in the great global confrontation that is now emerging. The United States not only practiced lawfare against China, but was pushed by China and by the tough line that Meng Wanzhou, with considerable personal courage, I might add, stuck to, into, in effect, admitting the fact. And I can't help but think that this admission that the United States practices lawfare, this implicit admission, if you like, but admission nonetheless, together with the fact that it practiced lawfare, in this case, is going to redound to America's disadvantage. It might have been better for the US's international reputation, in fact, if Meng Wanzhou had indeed been extradited to the United States and tried there, and if a US court had then acquitted her. Embarrassing that might have been, but it would nonetheless have vindicated the American justice and legal system. Ending this arrangement in this sort of way sends an extremely bad message all around the world. It in effect admits that the United States acted like a kidnapper in seizing, in having Meng Wanzhou seized and in keeping her in detention for 3 years. Well, I make all of these points. I appreciate there's some people who are not going to be happy with the points I'm making. I do feel about the subject, the topic of lawfare, very strongly. After all, I did work in the justice system in Britain for many years, and it's something that I do care about. But there it is. One way or the other, that is the position we are in. It is another case which shows that the United States lies at a fork in the road. It continues along this path, the path that John Bolton, the liberal interventionists, the neocons, all the various people gathered together in Washington who insist upon the United States taking an interventionist active role in the world, disregarding perhaps its own traditions and its legal system. If that continues, then to my mind, ultimately, the damage that the United States will suffer from will become, at some point, irretrievable. We might indeed be much closer to that point already than many Americans understand. Or the American people, and I think there is still time and space for this, might step back. They might say that this sort of behavior, this kind of conduct, is unacceptable for the United States. Other countries might practice this sort of thing, but the Republic, the American Republic, founded on its Constitution, based on its laws, true to its democratic traditions, does not. Well, that is the fork in the road that the United States has reached. It's not for me to make that decision for the American people, for the American political class, but it seems to me that it is the decision that they must now make. Which way they choose to go will determine, well, history and the history of their own country. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I hope you recognize my own feelings about this matter and why I have spoken perhaps rather strongly about it. I hope you will join me again in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. You can also find me on Locals at the Duran channel there. Locals being this wonderful new platform that we are now increasingly active in. You will find that I'm posting an increasing amount of exclusive content there, which you can follow up and learn about. And you will also find that our community, our very thriving community, publishes a lot of content of its own. And you can also find us on other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and the rest, and perhaps above all, the new free speech platform, SuperU. Also, if you want to support this hard-working channel, you can do so by donating to us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And of course, you can also go to our shop and buy the amazing things we have there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And if you've liked this program, or perhaps approved of what I've said, or agree with it in some form, or perhaps even if you don't agree with it, but still found this conversation or discussion interesting, well, please remember to press the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.